What I see is that a lot of people are too scared to live their life because they're too scared to make a mistake. I don't think these are permanent states of existence and
Right.
these are like failures or successes. And I really think we need to calm down a little bit with like how we talk about the human experience because no one is passing with like like what does it mean to pass with flying colors as a human? Like it's so unrealistic. And so I think as long as you're willing to be honest and humble and apologize and make amends and make changes, like live your life.
Well, hello there, and welcome to this episode of The Terry Cole Show. On today's episode, I am talking to a therapist who online you may know her as the Millennial Therapist. Her name is Sarah Kubrick, very brilliant young woman. I love her work. I really just found her work, I think, on Instagram, where I was like, wow, this person is very smart. And I really appreciate original thinkers, and she is that. So in this interview, Sarah and I talk all about her new book, which is called It's on Me, Accept Hard Truth, Discover Yourself, and Change Your Life. And what's interesting about Sarah is that she's an existential psychotherapist. She's a writer, she's a consultant, she's also a columnist for USA Today, but she was born in Yugoslavia and raised in Canada, but she experienced war more than once in her life. Being born in Yugoslavia, but then that became Bosnia, going then to Serbia. And that experience absolutely impacted who she became and what she wanted to do with her life. I think this book is really terrific, all about basically how can we become the people we want to be? How can we change our lives if the lives we're leading are not satisfying to us? So I hope that you enjoy this interview with Sarah Kubrick, the Millennial Therapist, as much as I enjoyed interviewing her. I'm super duper excited to welcome Sarah Kubrick, otherwise known as the Millennial Therapist, to the Terry Cole Show. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's so nice that you know my name and not just my handle.
I know. I mean, your handle is pretty famous, though. So, I mean, high class
Yeah,
problems to a degree.
can't complain at all. Yeah.
Right. Oh, so many questions. What I was telling the listeners, the audience at the top, is how I came upon you through your work on Instagram, which is interesting, and I'm sure that's how a lot of people found you. And I was like, then I saw a picture of you and I was like, how fucking old is this girl? Like, she seems awfully young to have that wise brain. And you are kind of young to have that wise
Mhm.
brain. But then I looked into your background, which we're going to share with the listeners and the viewers. And I was like, oh, it makes sense what you have
Mm.
experienced in your life. So let's start with what brought you to where you are? What brought you to becoming a therapist and a specific kind? Being an existential psychotherapist, there's a specific thing in there that I want to talk about as
Mhm.
well. But can you tell us a little bit about growing up in Yugoslavia and your life?
Yeah, of course. I found it fascinating being on social media at the start where people obviously didn't know my background and they were making so many assumptions about who I am. And so much pushback of like, you've never lived through anything difficult probably in your entire life. You're this entitled American. I'm not even American, but you're this entitled American. Like there were so many harsh labels that
Mm,
I was really surprised by. And my story is not one I talk about often just because I wanted it to be expressed in a way that allowed it to be meaningful. So in my book is the first time I actually talk about my childhood experience. I think like dropping little things of like, by the way, seems so disrespectful to what truly
mm,
happened. And it seems so incomplete that I just almost never bothered.
yeah.
And I guess for the listeners, if you don't know me and you haven't read my book yet, a little bit about my background is that I was actually born in Bosnia, a little before the Bosnian War, Bosnian genocide occurred. My entire family was there, and then we escaped and moved to Serbia. And then around age 8, the Kosovo War started. And we were there during that time. Actually, halfway through, we escaped back to Bosnia. And then at age 9, I immigrated to Canada. So I think it was a unique life experience. I think it kind of stole my childhood a little bit. It got me asking these really existential questions really, really early on in terms of
Mm-hmm.
like, why are we even here? And who am I? Because when I came to Canada, Serbians are portrayed as terrorists in almost every movie. I remember the early 2000s just being like, we're really not that bad. But, it was like every Serbian on TV was a terrorist. Like, it was really
Mm,
fascinating time. And I just remember it being like, who am I? What is the purpose of life? How can people be so cruel to one another when they don't know each other? And I got very fascinated by humanity and some of those deeper topics. Like Dostoevsky became my favorite author when I was 9. Like, who reads
stop.
Dostoevsky when they're 9? But that's because I felt like most people couldn't relate to the questions I was asking at 9. And so when I
Right,
was reading him, I was like, oh, he gets it.
right,
And that's
right.
like, it's such a weird childhood that I had, but that's kind of a bit about my background.
So, in surviving war, genocide,
Hmm.
escaping a war
Yeah.
torn place, I mean, all of these things obviously impact the development of your mind and your worldview and
Hmm.
all of those things. So, how do you think? I mean, this then propelled you. Tell us a little bit more about. Then you decided to become a therapist.
Yeah. People often ask me, like, when did you know? And I don't know a time I didn't know. I
Mm-hmm.
think I was so curious when I first wanted to study psychology. I don't even know I knew that was a thing. I was like, I just want to understand people. I just really wanted to understand. And I think that's where the curiosity of it, I wanted to make sense of the world. And that's what kind of led me to psychology initially. And then I think my motivation obviously changed over time, where it was like, how can I contribute to healing or alleviating pain or suffering more than just curiosity itself? But I just think it was a natural transition of seeing so much pain and going, what can I do? And why does it happen? And so I never really truly wanted to be anything else.
So interesting how
Hmm.
the interest in people's stories, because of course your interest could have gone a million different ways with your life
Mm.
experience, moving into the book. So the book is called It's on Me, Accept Hard Truths, Discover Yourself, and Change Your Life. Pre-sales are happening right now. So you guys,
Right now.
you can go buy this book right now.
Yes,
Amazon,
please.
everywhere. You go to Sarah's website, which is sarah-kubrick.com. Don't worry, all of this will obviously be in the show notes for you. So back to the book. Why now for this
Hmm.
book?
I think self loss, which is the topic of the book, is something
Mm-hmm.
that I personally struggled with for such a long time without understanding what it was. And this is a book written for myself. Like, it's a book I wish I had when I was 20, or really at any point. But for me, the self loss really manifested in my 20s. And I think there was such a deep sense of brokenness and disorientation and unhappiness, and I had no idea why, that it was hard to repair it, if we want to call, or recover it, all these beautiful words, heal it, whatever you want to use as like the psych terminology of it. But I just had no idea what was going on. All I knew was that I was doing something that was quote unquote successful and admirable. I was in grad school, I was seeing clients, it was great. I was in a long-term relationship. People are like, wow, so happy for you. I was checking off all the boxes, and I was the unhappiest I've ever been. And I just didn't know why. And then I realized as time went on and I saw clients, it wasn't just me that was experiencing something like this. And through my research and my master's degree actually started, I kind of stumbled upon the concept of self loss. And then I've studied that concept for almost 7 years now. And I think I realized that our society as a whole is having an existential crisis, is having an identity crisis. And I'm seeing more and more of it. And part of that is probably because I'm looking for it. When you're like, if you're like a trauma expert, all you see is trauma. And
It's
so
so
I'm
true.
sure that as an existentialist, all I see are like existential crises.
Hmm.
And so I was just seeing such a large amount of people come into my therapy sessions or online, talk about things like this, and feel like they're making decisions that don't align. They're in relationships that don't make sense. They lack fulfillment. So they're doing behaviors that are not serving them, and they just couldn't crack it. And I went, wow, okay, so maybe this is the time for this book. And I felt like I was in a place where I've come on the other side of it, and I can speak about it with passion and hope, because it's something that I feel like I've lived through, and I've managed to kind of wrap my head around and come on the other end. Although I feel like, life is a journey. I'm sure there'll be cycles of it, but
Right.
I came to a place where I was like, I can confidently speak about this because I've helped so many people with it. I've lived through it, and I feel like the timing is right, especially once COVID hit.
How would you
Yeah.
define self loss? Like, just for anyone listening, where obviously from a macro view, we get it, but how do you define it?
So I define it as being estranged or lacking congruence, resonance, and alliance with who you truly are. So
Mm.
for some people, it looks like having absolutely no idea. They're so disoriented. They look at their day, they wake up one day and go, I have no idea why I'm here or how my life got here, or I don't even know what kind of like hamburger I prefer. Like some people will just realize like I really have zero idea of who I am. And people will ask me basic questions, and the reason I can't answer is because I genuinely don't know.
Mm.
And it's so hard for me to make decisions, and it's so hard for me to kind of live with any sort of meaning or value. And you just kind of feel like you're drowning or floating aimlessly. And then there's those who will notice how their actions don't align with who they thought they were. So they'll keep
Mm.
doing things, and they'll just like be like, why did I just do that? That makes no sense. That is not how I understand myself to be. And if you do that too many times, you will no longer know who that is. You will feel
Mm.
so fragmented, so disoriented, because your actions and your perception of who you are completely on like two different spectrums. And the issue with that is that if you lack congruency, all you have is confusion. And, in the book, I talk about the importance of your actions forming your sense of self. And so it's kind of the sense of self is estrangement and also just lack of alliance in the way that we interact with the world.
But I love
Mm-hmm.
this, and I love the whole concept because I see it obviously in my therapy practice
Mm-hmm.
as well. And the people pleasing and the codependency and the bad boundaries and the so much of this all
Yes.
speaks to this loss of a sense of self or a strong center of
Yeah.
self. So it's kind of interesting that the way that you're describing this is similar to the way that I talk about our authentic selves. Like, what I
Mm-hmm.
don't love is when people will talk about authentic selves as if it's like in the center of an onion, and that all we have to do is peel away the layers, and our fully
No.
developed authentic self is just going to be shiny and bright and
Pop
pop
out.
out. And
Yeah.
I always feel like we actually really have a lot of decisions to
Yeah.
make.
Oh, you make me so happy. The one thing I really push against in this book is the concept of finding yourself, actually. That term really bothers me because
Me
that
too.
means there is a preconceived self. There is a self that already exists, and all you have to do is find it. And I
Mm-mm.
don't think that that's true at all, nor do I think the self is static. The self is molded with every single decision that you make. You can have an inauthentic self, you can have an authentic self,
Mm.
but you can't have both. And what makes that difference is your actions. It's a thing that you perpetually create, perpetually align with, perpetually protect. It is not something that just appears and then you grab it and you're like, yes. And I think that that's kind of the exhausting part of it, is that there is no goal in terms of like, now you found it, congratulations, have the rest of your, like, have a nice life. It's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, you need to learn how to create an authentic self rather than create an inauthentic self, which is what most of us do,
Right.
and then keep creating it. And that's going to look so different depending on your age, your context as you go through life.
Okay, so we're establishing this process. So how can people listening who are like, yes, this is me. I feel like there's a loss of self. I feel like I'm a people pleaser, blah blah blah. How can they embrace that self-discovery process when
Hmm.
sometimes the truth of what we may find, or if we actually objectively look at our behaviors,
Mm.
it could be painful. So how do you help people through that process of like still embracing that self-discovery, even though it might suck a little bit?
Yeah. So there's an example I use in the book of Runaway Bride. I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. It's with Julia Roberts. It's really like it's so random. And she is known as the girl that like bails during her weddings and never gets married.
Hmm.
She makes it to the island and just bails. And so there is a journalist that gets really interested in her story and kind of follows her around. And there's this like really intense scene where he essentially they're screaming at each other in a parking lot. He goes, "You don't even know who you are. You don't even know what kind of eggs you like to eat." Because whenever he would ask her previous quote unquote victims what eggs she liked, they would always say, "Oh, same as me. She liked to scramble. She liked to poach. She liked to this," which means she never had a concrete idea of what kind of eggs she liked. She just ate what her partners liked to eat.
Mm.
And she had this moment of like horrid realization. And later there's a scene where she makes a bunch of eggs out of her house, sits there and tries them all and figures out what she likes to eat. And I think that that's such
Mm.
a powerful scene. And I think before she could get to the point of like, I'm going to sit down and make all these eggs, she had to realize that she didn't know what eggs she liked. And as
Right.
much as we hate the truth, it's there anyways, even if you refuse to see it. The truth doesn't go anywhere.
No.
And the truth is such a great foundation on which you can build, on which you can change things. But if
Hmm.
you don't want to accept it, the change process is so hard, if not impossible. And so, what I encourage people to do is find beauty and freedom in the truth, regardless of what it looks like. Like, start
Hmm.
to appreciate truth for what it is. And I think that that can be so rewarding. And I think when you start to look at yourself in a mirror and start to recognize that person and start to respect that person and appreciate that person, you will realize that the hard stuff was so worth it. Once you get that taste of what it's like to be aligned and to have ownership over yourself, I don't think there's a greater motivation than that.
So beautiful. There's something about trying to drop the judgment. You know how much our fear mind
Mm,
uses judgment to protect. And, you know, one of my mentors, David Simon, who is one of Deepak's partner at the Choker Center,
mhm.
he would do a whole talk on yum yuck and how we just walk around in life like distracting the shit out of ourselves, yumming and yucking all over everything from, oh, I like her skirt, but oh, why would she wear those boots with that? Like just
Yeah.
all over, all over.
Mm,
And it's a distraction, of course, but it's also a way of being self-protecting, where
of
if we're
course.
so positive, like we got the right and wrong, part of the problem, of course, with this, when we're super judgmental, then it's really hard to face the truth of maybe some of the not great decisions we've made, or the
Hmm.
way that we've treated folks, or the way that we've self abandoned, right? And it's like you have to move away from, I feel like, all of that self judgment if you're going to be able to do the work. And like you said, embrace the truth of what the truth can do for you, which
Mm,
is set you free. I mean, listen, now that's that, whatever. I mean, was
totally.
that Martin Luther King? That I didn't make that up, but someone said it.
Someone said it. Yeah, I feel like we think we're scared of the truth and we feel like truth is a punishment. And I think societally we feel that way. And I think changing our relationship to the truth, as you said, like there is so much beautiful freedom and opportunity once you're allowing yourself to see things as they are. And so, yeah, absolutely. The judgment piece is huge. I think learning to observe without inflicting judgment
Hmm.
is huge. Observation is your friend. Like you can observe that you're incongruent. You don't need to hate yourself for the fact that you're being incongruent. You don't need to shame yourself for the fact that you're incongruent. You can just go, right now, I'm being incongruent. Now it's up to you to change how you act. It's
Right.
really as simple as that.
And it's how can we possibly get radically curious
Mm,
rather than being so self just all the mea culpa, all the how bad we are, all of the how stupid or we deserve the bad things that happen, or being in total denial of them. What
Mm,
if, we just moved into a place of curiosity, like, huh, well, that's interesting. Why am I acting in a
mm,
non-congruent way right now? What is it? When did it happen? Who was I around? So again, this self, as you're inviting us to do with the book, there's a certain amount of self reflection but we
absolutely.
need this space to self reflect
Hmm.
without the baseball bat bashing us in the face, you know?
Absolutely. I think inner dialogue is so important. I don't think we understand how much we speak to ourselves all the time, nonstop. For most people, it's not intentional. It's not productive.
Yeah.
It's not kind. Like we forget that we're talking to a human being and everything we know about communication goes out the window. And I think approaching people with curiosity and kindness and openness and taking a moment to really listen to what the other person has to say, all of these things apply. Setting boundaries, all of these things apply. And so I
Hmm.
think it's really just important to embrace inner dialogue unless you want to be an autopilot. Because really, that's the only other option that I see is that you aimlessly sleepwalk through life and you don't take ownership of anything that you do.
Right.
But even passive decisions are still decisions. Even
Yes.
indecisions are decisions. The thing is that I try to drive home is you can't avoid decisions.
Hmm.
You can think you're avoiding decisions. You can have the comfort of ignoring decision making, but you still made a decision. And so I think that that's one part that makes people feel super exhausted. But once you make it intentional, once you make it meaningful, that decision making will be more fun, more fulfilling, and easier.
And less fear driven, right? Like
Oh,
part of it
yes.
is just let yourself make a mistake. I was always motivated by those.
Mm,
I'm trying to think of who it was. Michael Jordan had a commercial out years ago, and it was all about trying and asserting yourself and hoping. And he was like, "You see all the baskets I make, but you don't see the billions that I've missed."
mm,
And so part of it is the whole thing was like to try to not stigmatize failure, like to normalize this experience of trying
yes.
and failing, trying again, doing something different, but how we're always sort of seems to be a lot of pressure to like achieve or to get it perfectly right, you know?
And I think that's even with authenticity or like your sense of self. It's trial and error. When I talk about people developing their sense of self, sometimes you won't know that something doesn't align until you do it. That's just the reality of it. And sometimes you'll be surprised by the things that align that you thought would never align. And I think it's just about understanding you're not going to fail. There's no failing, but there are trials and errors. And as long as you're willing to pivot to learn, that's amazing. That's a beautiful, fulfilling life that you're genuinely using up. What I see is that a lot of people are too scared to live their life because they're too scared to make a mistake. They're too scared that there's going to be like this repercussion that it's just unimaginable and they won't be able to handle. And part of that is lack of trusting that they will be able to handle their errors and their quote unquote mistakes and their lessons. And that, for some of them, they'll be better off with learning more about themselves. And so I think when we talk about like, oh, you're being so inauthentic, you're being so, it's like, this is not like a pass fail sort of thing.
Right.
This is like, you're like learning. And during this process, you really nailed what aligned with you. And then now you didn't. And now you can just adjust. And so I don't think these are permanent states of existence. And
Right.
these are like failures or successes. And I really think we need to calm down a little bit with like how we talk about the human experience because no one is passing with like like what does it mean to pass with flying colors as a human? Like it's so unrealistic. And so I think as long as you're willing to be honest and humble and apologize and make amends and make changes, like live your life.
Right.
That's also the
Yeah.
existentialist in me, like do it.
Seriously. And it's interesting, the existential aspect of all of
Yeah.
this. Like I will at different points talk about the existential loneliness that comes
Mm,
along with living an inauthentic life.
yeah.
Meaning if you're a people pleaser, if your boundaries suck, if you're saying yes when you want to say no endlessly, all of that endless self abandonment, which is basically what you and I both actually teach about,
Mhm.
how you can be more lonely or lonely in an existential way, being with people who are supposed to be your people, but they don't
Mm.
really know you.
Oh, that's such a painful experience. And I think it's like grieving the fairy tale of it. You know, it's like I'm pouring all this effort in and it's going to give me what I want. And that's why I'm suffering. And then you come to the end of it and you realize you didn't actually get what you wanted or what was promised out there. That, like, if you do what people want you to do, they're going to love you, you're going to belong.
Mm,
And you come at the end of that road and you go, I'm still lonely. I'm still unappreciated. People don't see me for who I am. And I think it's an absolutely heartbreaking position to find yourself in. And
mhm,
I think there's something inherently isolating about being human. Even if you're authentic, no one
mm,
will ever understand what it's like to be you.
right.
And this is something I talk to clients all the time. I'm like, accepting that loneliness or that isolation in terms of, like, even if you have the best relationships, there is a point to which no one will understand you, and at which you have to be your own best friend, and you are all you have, because we die alone, we're born alone, and for the most part we're the only ones that truly understand what is happening. And I think that's a hard thing for people to accept, that loneliness is actually kind of part of the human condition. And the more we make peace with that, and the more that we find comfort or some meaning in that, the better it is.
Oh man, that is so incredibly true, and I think that it's something that we don't want to look at. I had an experience early in my early 30s where I was diagnosed with cancer, and I'm
Wow.
fine obviously now. But it was an experience where what I learned at that age, which I was still, it's still a relatively young age, was that you're the same way you're born alone and you die alone, that your health is like
Mm,
you're the only one who can actually take responsibility for it. And as much as my husband, who was
mm,
only my boyfriend at the time, was very active and came to everything with me and was super amazing, when you're in there
yeah.
getting a biopsy, like it's just you, right? Like
Mm,
you are beefing yourself up and being like, you're fine. We can do this. We're okay. Like it's
mm-hmm,
you and you. And I think that exactly what you said, Sarah, is so important about how we have to be the ones in a real way to have our own backs, to have a good relationship with ourselves, to hold ourselves in high esteem.
mm.
We can't be looking all externally for that stuff,
No. And what would happen if we put just half the effort we put into others into ourselves? I am not sure at what point we decided it was more important to have external relationships. Don't get me wrong, we are social creatures. We
Yeah.
need genuine connection and love. That is so, so important. But equally important is the relationship you have with yourself. And I think most people, if they were to, like, have a little log throughout the day, would be thinking about others, like, oh, is that colleague angry? Oh, I didn't call my mom. Okay, what can I do for my husband? Okay, my boy. And it's not like, okay, what does Sarah need right now? What am
Yeah.
I feeling? What is my body? Am I reaching my limit? Okay, what do I want to share with myself? How do I want to treat myself? Like, most of the dialogue is really not about us. And I just wonder what would happen if we took even half that time and
Mhm.
invested in ourselves. Yes, date night is so important. You know what else is important?
Mhm.
Alone time. And so if
Yeah.
all you're doing is date nights, A plus for that, and you might want to carve out some time for yourself. And so I think that balance makes it, a little difficult for people, but I think we just underestimate the importance. The relationship you have with yourself will reflect with the relationships you have with others, and you just can't avoid yourself for too long. At some point, life will throw something at you, and
Mhm.
you're going to have a really rude awakening, unless you do it willingly, like through reading my book. No. And you go
Correct.
through that work before things get bad. But what I have found, that most people, when it comes to identity work or self work, usually something sets them off. They feel like they've hit a rock bottom of a sort. And then they go, okay, I really got to invest in myself. And I just hope that people won't have to get to that point before they start doing this.
Yes, what I love to say is, of all the crap I've been through in my life, I always say, I held up a gunpoint to cancer diagnoses, whatever. You don't have to have that. Like, you actually
Yeah,
can learn from what I learned. Like, those are life altering experiences.
yeah.
And there's something, and listen, Sarah, you also know, being a clinician, sometimes we can't. Sometimes people cannot tell us. Sometimes we really must have
We
the
really
experience.
must.
We really
Absolutely.
must.
Absolutely. And I think another thing I really wanted people to know is like, we talk about like self loss, which is such a daunting concept. You don't need to live through wars, for example,
Mm,
like me, and I try to make that
yeah.
clear, to experience self loss. Something I say in my book is like, I actually found my early 20s a lot more traumatizing than my childhood. And people are so shocked when I say that. And I go, you need to understand, well, first of all, you can't evaluate people's experiences based on like objectively what's worse because that doesn't exist. It's
Hmm.
how you experienced an event. But second of all, the 20s were worse because I was a willing participant in my loss. While the things that happened to me in my childhood, I had absolutely no power or responsibility over. And although they contributed to my sense of loss, my 20s were almost more traumatizing because I saw myself hurt myself. And
Yes.
I think that's an interesting thing to keep in mind of like the listener doesn't have to go through what we went through, which it sounds like we both have some really extreme experiences
Hmm.
to start working on yourself. But also if you are feeling lost, I don't want you to feel like you can't be, like you don't have the right to be because you haven't lived through something really big.
Yes.
And sometimes it just sneaks up on you. Sometimes it's just, spending a couple years not being intentional. It doesn't have to be
Hmm.
this big, big thing that now you're like, oh, now I can say I have self loss. So that's just something that made me think of that.
So I have two more questions for you. So
Yeah.
what does It's On Me, which is the name of
Yeah.
the book, what does that stand for?
What it stands for is responsibility.
Mm,
I mean, as an existentialist, I feel like responsibility is such a huge theme, but I wanted it to be empowering responsibility. So if you have power, you are responsible. If you don't have power, you're not responsible. Kind of like me as a child in the war, I wasn't responsible for that. I had zero power. And I think if you look at your life and you go, I don't like the way my life is, that should be empowering to you. You know why?
mm,
Because you created it. Of
yep.
course, there's external factors that played into it. I'm not saying, but it's like you now have the power to create something you do want. And I really want people to like see this and go, okay, I'm responsible, but I am so there. I am so ready to change it. And it is on me to change it. As you said, like, yes, your boyfriend at the time could go to the doctors with you, but you were the one getting the biopsy. And
Right.
I think same with healing. It's like someone can, a therapist can be next to you, but it's really at the end of the day, it's on you to decide how you want to live your life. And, I have an example of like, we all know a Chad, I call him Chad, whose parents went through a divorce when he was in high school and it was really difficult for him and super traumatizing and not a good home situation. But now you see Chad in his 20s and 30s and he's mistreating every single partner that he's with. And then you have to go, at what point does Chad have to take responsibility for the way that he's hurting his partners or for the way that he's showing up? At what point is Chad responsible to work through his parents' divorce?
Right.
So, right, that's not to say that it wasn't painful, it wasn't traumatizing, didn't impact him. That's to say that if Chad wants a happy, fulfilling life, fairly or unfairly, he's got to do something about it. And it's not about, Chad fixing his behavior so his next partner is happy. No, I actually care about Chad. I want Chad to be happy. And so
Right.
that's like the responsibility piece where it's like, I know life is so, so freaking unfair.
Hmm.
And still, you can't surrender in terms of you are still responsible to do what comes after the unfairness. And you
Yes.
deserve so much. You deserve the best. And so if you can give yourself that, I encourage everyone to do so. That's the title.
I love it. All right. So I'm going to ask you one last boundary question, but you guys, the author is Sarah Kubrick. She is the millennial therapist. Follow her on Instagram if you're not. I can't believe you're not, because if you're following me, I can't even tell you how many times I've reposted her stuff, like 40 at this point.
Oh,
The new book is called It's On Me, Accept Hard Truth, Discover Yourself, and Change Your Life. Available everywhere for pre-order. So you want to go get that book immediately, if not sooner. So where can people find you besides on Instagram as the Millennial Therapist? Where else can they
yeah.
find you, Sarah?
So I think you listed my website. The other platform that I'm really enjoying right now is Substack, where I have free weekly newsletters, or if you subscribe, a little more content. And what I love about it is I like to talk about deeper, more existential things, and sometimes certain platforms don't allow for that. And so
Yeah.
I've been really leaning into just longer form writing. It's free, it's an amazing community. So if you're interested in hearing more about these topics, particularly, meaning and identity, that's where you can find me. So just Substack, Sarah Kubrick.
Love it. All right, my last question for you. Personally,
Yes.
what has been your most challenging boundary struggle and how did you overcome it if you have?
Oh my God. I think lately, if I'm being very honest, it's work boundaries have been really, really difficult for me. And I don't know if I've overcome it. I usually just burn out and then calm down and then replenish and then go back, which is not a permanent solution. Um, you're like, no. But what I am trying to learn to do, and with someone who's like more type A personality is a little difficult, is do the bare minimum. That's been like something I've really been sitting with, of like honoring myself, and sometimes not, that's not a life motto, but sometimes finding moments where it's like do the bare minimum is almost a form of boundary for me when it comes to some certain work projects and work things. And so I'm really, really trying my best to balance the need and the desire and the passion and the fulfillment I get from work. And then also the fact that like I need to have a life outside of work. And so that's been something I'm grappling with a lot.
Yeah, I so understand. And how it really does, you see, because you're young, it's like there's a certain amount of bandwidth that you do have to continue that cycle until you get to a point where you're like, I don't want to keep
Yeah.
doing that. But there is something beautiful though about loving what you do and being so lit up about helping others and about sort of exploring these big and I mean existential questions. They are. Who are
Mm,
we and what are we doing here, basically? So
yeah.
I feel like I totally understand those. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. It was really nice to have you on the show. Thank you for all the work
So
that you're doing,
lovely.
for all the good brain power you're putting out there in the world for all of us. I really do appreciate you, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me. This conversation filled my soul, and you're amazing. And I've reposted you too. And I just have so much admiration for everything you do. So thank you.
You are welcome.